can you tell me about the time you grew up in?
I was the fifth child in our family. I had three sisters and one brother, and another child was born during the war. My parents were married in 1926. Both my parents grew up in large families and did not have higher education, just primary school and probably not even to grade 6. Their families were poor. My mother started working at the age of 14, staking out turf out of the ground, which was mainly used by poor people for heating and cooking. In her late teens, she moved to Amsterdam and learned to be a housekeeper and a cook. And this is where she saw how rich people lived, which affected the rest of her life. This is also where she met my dad. My father worked mostly in factories and repaired furniture on the side, radios, anything to make some extra money. He was a handyman. He would fix up whatever piece of furniture someone else would throw out. He would refinish it and stain it, and after the war, we really had a beautiful home. They both worked very hard, especially my mother, because she wanted her children to have more education, music lessons, and a nice home, which she had experienced in Amsterdam. So my childhood memories are of the war years, of course, and the years right after, since I was not even 1 year old when Germany invaded Holland. And because we were poor, we had very few toys, and the ones we had were handmade out of wood or cloth, as my doll was. But since I did not know any better, I was happy with my doll and with whatever we had. My dad and I would go for walks, and he would buy me a little ice cream bar, but I was not to tell my mother or the others, because this was a real luxury, and I guess he wanted to spoil me. We have celebrate in Holland St. Nicholas Day, which is on December the 5th. It's kind of like what you do here at Christmas, but our gifts were just socks, mitts, and scarves, and a little candy. It was pretty plain. All my clothes and shoes were hand-me-downs from my sisters, and once in a while I would get a new dress that my mother made. And I did not have my first pair of new shoes until I was about 12 years old.
So, how did the war and the German occupation and its policies impact your family and your community?
All right. Since the occupation came without warning, it was a real shock to the Dutch people, since Holland was neutral. And soon Nazi flags with the swastikas were flying from many, many places in town. And they would also occupy the homes of the rich people, the larger homes from the rich people. But because I was just a little kid, that did not really affect me personally. I didn't know any better. So freedoms were gradually limited, as permission slips were needed for many things, and I didn't see aunts and uncles in other towns for several years because traveling was difficult and cost too much money. Schooling for my older siblings was interrupted, and books in schools disappeared, especially history books.
And did you experience famine or deteriorating living conditions?
Yes, we did, because the Nazis would go into civilian homes and take our bikes. My dad had a beautiful motorbike, or beautiful, it was a second-hand one he'd fixed up, but he treasured it, and that was taken away, and people who had cars, they took pretty well whatever they needed, and near the end of the war, they took food as well. Also, coal was in short supply because the Nazis used a lot of it, and my dad and older sisters would go to the ship yards where the trains would come in that were loaded with coal, and once they were unloaded, or some would always be spilled, and they would go and pick up whatever was available, and many people would be along the train tracks to pick up the leftover coal. So living conditions gradually became more difficult, definitely, and because everything was becoming scarce, like soap. I remember we didn't have soap or toothpaste. And things that were wore out could not be replaced. Stores were getting more and more empty, and whatever was left was really for people who had cash, who were rich. Although we always had something to eat at mealtime, I wouldn't say we had famine, but our meals were not nutritious, and they just barely filled our bellies. There were no eggs or milk or cheese or meat. Mainly cabbage, potatoes, and some grains, maybe some rice. And we did not get that very often. When we had rice, I remember we just would get some brown sugar on it. Sometimes my mother would cook barley in water, let it get cold overnight, and then the next day she would slice it and fry it along with onions, and this would resemble the meat portion on our plates. But to us, it tasted great.
Can you describe to me some of your memories of you and your family's closest encounters with the war at the time?
Sure. My first memory as a child is when I was about 3 years old, and it was in the middle of the night, and when we heard noises and woke up, and a couple of soldiers had broken down our front door, and they came barging up the wooden stairs and into my parents' bedroom. And all I could see was their tall black leather boots that the soldiers wore. And they yelled at my dad, who by now had jumped out of bed and was putting his pants on over his long johns. And I remember being so scared that I didn't dare move. I didn't understand as a 3-year-old what was going on at the time, but I found out later that my dad and other older men had been picked up that night and put on trains and taken to Germany to work in their war machinery factories. My dad was about 50 years old, and he later escaped, and I don't know how long he actually was in Germany, but he was a broken man when he came back. And also, my dad's brother was with what was called the NSB, which is a nationalist socialist movement, and they were sympathizers with the Nazis. And I don't think he was of the same persuasions really of that group, but he joined them to get more food for his family and favors from the Germans. But this was very upsetting for my parents and for the whole family. I did not see or get to know that uncle really until many years after the war. I do believe that he was ashamed of his cowardly actions because he really was a very kind man. But I know that this was a big family issue after the war. And this is a sad story. Our neighbor was a shoemaker, and the Germans kept him very busy fixing their boots and their shoes. And one day a Nazi came to pick up his boots, but they were not ready yet. And he was so angry that he shot the neighbor right then and there in his workshop. And I remember the shock and the consternation among the grown-ups around me. And we were not allowed as kids to leave our wooden fenced backyard, but somehow I remember looking through a hole in the wooden door and to see what was going on. And there was a lot of commotion. And later on, I had overheard what had happened. And I remember as a little girl, it made me very quiet and sad.
So, can you describe to me your memories at the end of the occupation and the liberation of the Netherlands? And how
Sure.
did this affect you and your family?
Okay. Nearing the end of the occupation, and I have better memories of that. I was getting now up to 5 years of age, but the higher-up Nazis had already gone back to Germany because they knew the end was coming. So it was mainly the soldiers on the ground that were, there until the end. And our house was a corner house and had a straight, long hallway that went from the front door right to the back door. And at one point in time, and this was near the end as the Allied forces were flushing out these pockets of Germans, but at one end were Canadian soldiers and there were German soldiers on the other end. And we were all in their cellar, and they were shooting at each other through the hallway. And thankfully, the Canadians won, and when they told us we could come out of the cellar, we saw many bullet holes in the walls. But the great part for us kids was that the Canadians gave us chocolate, which was amazing, and I know it was a really happy time. And my dad got a pack of cigarettes, and it was like great celebrations. It was super. The buildings that the Germans had taken over while they occupied our city had a lot of furniture, and many things left were in it. And like there were bikes, and there was food, and there was coal, and people were just going crazy, going in there with bags and just helping themselves to whatever they could find. And my dad took a large brass lamp. I don't know whether that was the right thing to do or not, but he did. And he took it all apart, and he remodeled it into candle holders and smaller lamps, and I still have one in my house today.
How did you feel as a youth living in post-war Netherlands as the country continued to rebuild?
It was all kind of okay for me because I did not know what things were like before the war, and so everything was kind of new and exciting for me because I started school that same year, and a lot of things were happening now that we could not do during the war, and so they were all new experiences for me. We could play outside again, which was nice, and rather than most of the time always being kept in our fenced yard. And the visits with relatives was great, and going to the country. And this is an interesting thing. It was during my early teens that our church youth group went to Germany, actually, by bus to stay with a German family for a long weekend, and we met German youth. And this was organized by the churches to promote healing between the countries. And later on, the Germans that we had met would come to our homes. And I'm sure this must have helped, but it did take, even for me, even young as I was and did not experience the war as the older people did, it still took many years to get over negative feelings towards the Germans.
Did your experiences of this war influence your family's decision to immigrate to Canada? And if so, how did it?
Not my whole family immigrated to Canada. My parents never did, but 5 of the 6 children did, and not all at the same time either. But yes, I would say that the war experiences and the conditions afterwards for quite a years, they definitely were part of the reason that we went. One of the reasons was that in Holland it was very hard to get a job. And I know that some of my siblings did have their education interrupted, and so they would have some education, but not the diplomas that they needed to actually get a job. And it was not like it was here in Canada when we came. You could get a job anywhere, work in a restaurant, whatever you wanted or were able to do. If you could work, you could get a job. And it was my sister who first came to Canada. And when she came back, because she had a friend here and who had immigrated to Canada, and so my sister came back with her friend a couple of years later and told my brother and I that we should come. And she told us that you could get ahead here in Canada if you work hard, that there were plenty of jobs, and you didn't necessarily need a diploma, and that people owned their own homes here. And in Holland there still is always a housing crisis. And the government actually helped you to immigrate. They encouraged immigration, and the Canadians wanted us to come. The Dutch government even paid for our passage by boat, 10-day journey, and gave us several $100 to get us started in Canada.
When did you emigrate to Canada?
January the 4th, 1958.
And where did you arrive?
Halifax.
So what message do you want to give to young people like us today based on your experiences in the war? And what lessons do you think are the most important?
Be thankful for your education. It's a privilege that many people in this world, or children in this world, still do not have access to. Freedom of religion. That's a wonderful freedom. We should respect every religion that promotes peace with fellow man, and not like Hitler, who believed that the German race was better than any other, especially the Jews, and 6 million Jews were killed. Instead, respect and protect every human being, regardless of race, color, religion, culture differences, doesn't matter. Speech, yes, freedom of speech. That's during the war, you did not have freedom of speech. People had to be very careful what you said, even to neighbors, because you never knew who you could trust because of the NSB. And so people did not have the freedom to really speak freely. They were always cautious. But in this respect, I would say use speech for the betterment of others. And for what you say today will affect someone either positively or negatively, and maybe even for the rest of their lives.
Thank you for those messages.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so that just about wraps up our interview. Thank you very much. We really appreciate your time and your wisdom and all your experiences.
Well, you're very, very welcome. And tell your teacher I want to get marked on this.
I'll make sure I will. Yeah.
Okay?
Okay, thank you very, very much. All right.
Thank you, Alex. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.